What's up, guys? Welcome back to White Sox Daily. I'm Aaron Feely once again as the Chicago White Sox continue to find their name kind of spinning around in the old rumor mill here. Continue to be attached to several names, a couple of eyebrow raisers as well, and yet another potential reunion being thrown around out there. So we'll just jump right on into it. We're going to start things off today talking about with the Murakami signing, knowing that he's at first base now, what is the infield going to shape up and look like, especially after these talks about Yoan Moncada potentially making a return to the Chicago White Sox? Where would they potentially play him? He's a guy that has some versatility, of course. Played some second base at the World Baseball Classic, as some may remember. He's a guy that the White Sox moved around a bit his last tenure here as well. Um, Primarily was a third baseman when he was here, a guy that has had a relatively disappointing career to this point. But if he were to show up here in Chicago, you've got Murakami at first, you've got Colston Montgomery at shortstop. I think those two are locked in. So then it becomes, what do you do with Miguel Vargas, Lenyn Sosa, Chase Mydroth? Who's going to be the utility guy? Who's going to be locked in there at second base? Between that group, you'd imagine that Vargas would be at third base, but you could potentially plug Lenyn Sosa over there just as easily. Yoan Moncada comes over. I think he's probably the third baseman just for the defensive upside alone, unless you just really, really want to see what you've got in Vargas or Sosa and let Yoan, let him know up front, hey, you're going to be kind of a rotational guy, a guy who just comes in when needed type of a deal. I would say, as it stands though right now, I would think most likely outline here is that it is Chase Mydroth at second, Miguel Vargas at third. Just for Mydroth's defensive abilities at second base, he is a really solid contact hitter as well. Lenyn Sosa, obviously coming off a year in which he led the team in home runs in 2025, so you'd love to have him out there as an everyday player. But I just get the sense that if push comes to shove, they're going to prefer Chase Mydroth over at second base. Again, he's just a little bit better as a defender. He's a solid contact hitter. He's a guy who can get on base for you. Personally, I think I'd almost rather see Lenyn Sosa between the two of them more often, because I think he has a lot more offensive upside than Mydroth does. I think Lenyn Sosa is also getting better as a contact hitter, so I'd like to see if he can continue that growth and maybe even be at that level where he can hit kind of toward the top of the lineup. But my gut instinct says that if opening day were today, that the Chicago White Sox themselves would prefer Mydroth over at second base. But you guys let us know how you'd prefer to see the infield matchup and how you think it's going to down below in the comments section as we move things along. And we had a bit of a breaking story here as well in regards to some insider information coming to light in regards to that Murakami signing as we continue to speak about the infield and the surprise team that was that final obstacle for the Chicago White Sox in the bidding war for Murakami's services. There was a lot of speculation early on about, obviously the usual suspects, the Dodgers, the Los Angeles Angels were potentially a player, the San Francisco Giants a potential player, the New York Yankees, just from cash flow alone. Obviously, the Dodgers were the big name there, but we are now hearing confirmed reports that the final team in on the Murakami sweepstakes that the Chicago White Sox ended up having to outbid, that were also very interested in his services once it started to become clear that he wasn't going to command the big time bidding war that the Dodgers and Yankees would have traditionally been out there throwing checks around for, and that the White Sox had that opportunity. Another team that threw their hat in the ring and ended up being the last team standing before the White Sox won the battle was the Arizona Diamondbacks, who were very interested in bringing in the Japanese slugger, who, of course, ultimately came here thanks to some personal connections with his Swallows manager, who is a former relief pitcher for the Chicago White Sox. And just as he put it, a general alignment of philosophy and enjoying kind of where the White Sox are and what the mentality of the team is at this time. Those things all kind of ended up stacking together to make his decision to come to the Chicago White Sox a bit easier for him. But yeah, so an interesting tidbit there. The Arizona Diamondbacks were the final other team in that sweepstakes. Chicago White Sox managed to land him out from underneath the Diamondbacks' noses, and hopefully it leads to big and fantastic things for Chicago this coming season and for seasons to come. But another one of the big time positions of need for Chicago, we kind of hinted at it a little bit earlier on here in this episode. Another potential reunion. We talked about Moncada earlier. Another guy now being discussed as a potential fit with Chicago. The reunion in the bullpen with Michael Kopech being discussed as a potential option for the Chicago White Sox right now. The White Sox having a bit of interest there in bringing Kopech back. He was a guy that obviously showcased some promise, a dude who missed 2019 and 2020 due to an injury and then due to COVID, sitting out the 2020 season. Came back in 2021 exclusively out of the bullpen, was very solid for the Chicago White Sox in what ended up being kind of a magical season for him. Obviously, you had the Field of Dreams game that year, you had the playoff berth, you had the really excellent blackout home playoff game against the Houston Astros with the Garcia home run, with the Yasmani Grandal home run. A lot of fond memories of 2021, and Michael Kopech was a big part of that. I mean, just an absolute flamethrower that whole year, consistently hitting triple digits. They moved him back to his starting position the following season, where he was really good in 2022, took a step back in 2023, and then ended up ultimately being traded and spent last season with the Boston Red Sox, where he started off pretty solidly for Boston before injuries ended up catching up with him. And now he finds himself as a free agent once again, still unsigned. And now the talk is starting to circulate about a potential reunion with the Chicago White Sox. I think based on just where you are as this White Sox team, based on the really lack of available options remaining to you, I would certainly be all for a potential Michael Kopech reunion. And obviously the talk now would be to keep him where he's been at, keep him where he's been more comfortable in that bullpen role. But he's got some experience as a starter as well. One of his best seasons came with the White Sox as a starter. Now that's leaning on 4 years ago now, but it was as a member of the starting rotation, and the White Sox still need 2 more of those as well. So he'd add some versatility to your ball club as well. I think that would be a big time signing for the Chicago White Sox, someone that could absolutely come in and fill a role for you right off the bat. And then a guy that might be available to him if they want another reunion here as well. Somewhat of a disappointing player, not necessarily for the White Sox based on what they paid for him, but a ex-White Sox outfielder, a guy who had been really solid in AAA his whole career, but just couldn't seem to make it work on a big league roster, either with the Toronto Blue Jays or with the Chicago White Sox after they traded for him for cash considerations outright a couple of seasons ago. That would be Will Robertson, who has now been designated for assignment by the Baltimore Orioles after they just picked him up a month ago to make room on their 40-man roster. And Robertson, yeah, he'll have to clear waivers if he wants to stay with Baltimore, and if Baltimore wants to keep him there. And then even then, based on being his veteran status, he will now have to accept the designation for assignment to AAA once again, which is actually where he has been really solid to this point. We kind of mentioned that a little bit ago. In 2025 with the Toronto Blue Jays and the Chicago White Sox, batted just 129 across both those teams and in 27 appearances, 9 RBIs, 27 strikeouts in 27 games. and only 75 plate appearances, so he was striking out at a 1/3 rate. It was not going well at the big league level yet, but it was in a very small sample size. Still just 28 years old, a guy who could still have some of his best ball ahead of him. Obviously, he starts approaching that 30-year mark, and you get a little worried about it, but certainly not a player who's just dead in the water, completely plateaued or anything like that. And he has had a number of really great AAA seasons, 20 home run years. Just last season, in fact, 20 home runs and 21 doubles in just 89 AAA games. He's a guy that has started kind of getting that 4A player type of a tag attached to his name, and a guy that I'm assuming would love to get that unattached as fast as possible, looking for that next fresh start. Could be an option for a White Sox team that is completely lacking in options in the outfield. But that'll do it for today's episode. Thank you guys for joining us once again, and we'll see you tomorrow on White Sox Daily.